Um, all right, here we go. Hi, everyone. Another week gone by. Oops. Another week gone by. Once again, and felt like maybe, 2 days in this surreal time. I hope you're all doing well. The girls and I are hanging in there, though the baby's definitely starting to graduate from the enrichment that we can provide, as parents. So I'm very much hoping that everyone can just grit their teeth and white knuckle through a long enough stretch of time, wearing masks, avoiding big groups, and socializing outside in small groups. If your brain is about to explode from cabin fever, if you have to hang out with other people. All right. So I feel like most of us who have an interest in biomedical science have been dealing with pretty much exclusively negative news. Mostly just shocking disappointment, on so many levels that we begin to question just how advanced we can possibly objectively be. And to be clear, that disappointment, at least in my mind, is totally justified. However, at least to me, I think it's worth remembering that the source of that disappointment, the failure of this country to even come close to adequately respond to COVID-19, involves much, much more than just biomedical science. Anyways, given all that negativity, I thought it might be worth discussing some incredibly good news that biomedical science, and neuroscience in particular, has produced. That will certainly change the lives of an incredible number of people throughout the world in a very real, very tangible, very fundamental way. And so what I want to talk about is a novel and experimental treatment for Parkinson's disease. But first, unless you've been exposed to this disease, personally, maybe in your family or you yourself, you probably don't quite appreciate just how severe and how common this disease is. So in North America, well over 1 million people confront Parkinson's disease, and worldwide, over 4 million people. And so, of course, that's based on how many people are accurately diagnosed worldwide. So it could be, these numbers are almost certainly underestimates. And, as is probably widely appreciated, it's most commonly experienced later on in life. And because we're fortunate to be living a bit longer these days, the number of people who will end up encountering Parkinson's disease is expected to increase moving forward. So, I don't mean to be completely United States centric or US centric, but these are the data with which, I'm most familiar. And so here's the frequency of Parkinson's disease throughout the United States. And this is by state, obviously. And this is a number of deaths per 100,000 people. So, and I think these stats might surprise some folks. Or I don't, maybe not, I don't know. But anyways, the US states with the highest fatality rates that are attributable to Parkinson's are, in order, Utah, Minnesota, Idaho, Louisiana, Ohio, Nebraska, Tennessee, Alabama, Texas, and South Dakota. And, to be clear, I poked around to see if I could find similar sort of global distributions by country to see if the disease, see if we could see where perhaps it's more common throughout the world, and I couldn't really find a good one. But generally speaking, any country in which the population tends to live pretty long confronts this disease. And, as you can see, Americans in every state of the union confront this. It doesn't care about state borders or political differences or anything, right? So anyways, a group out of the University of Wisconsin in Madison, an excellent institution, published a set of experiments that attempts to pin down how stem cells might be able to treat Parkinson's. And one of the central issues with the treatment of conditions like Parkinson's disease is that a majority of the adult brain doesn't replace cells. So if neurons in most parts of the brain deteriorate or die, there's no reserve of neurons to replace them. So, unlike, when you have a cut on your skin, which over time will heal, and it could be you never lost those skin cells in the first place, the brain doesn't work that way. So if someone loses neurons, whether because there's a traumatic brain injury or, there's a neurodegenerative disease like Parkinson's, those neurons are pretty much gone for the rest of that person's life. So stem cells are super interesting types of cells. When we use the term stem cell, we're generally referring to a bunch of different types of progenitor cells, meaning a type of cell that over time can become a bunch of different other types of cells. There's a bunch of different kinds of stem cells. And I don't really intend to discuss all the theories of what causes Parkinson's disease because it's a huge topic. And the short story is, it seems like it's a mixture of genetic and environmental factors that can lead to a person developing Parkinson's. It's always a combination of genes and environment. But the epicenter of Parkinson's is a part of the brain called the substantia nigra, which is a major source of dopamine production in the brain. And you can sort of see here towards the label is up towards the top here, and it's named. The reason it has that name is if you look at this specific structure under a microscope, even without any kind of histological treatment, like you're not staining, you're not using any kind of antibodies, you're just looking at it with your eyeballs through a microscope, it looks dark to the naked eye. And so, like basically all parts of the brain, the substantia nigra has various subregions, and the substantia nigra, is no exception. And when it comes to Parkinson's, it's the substantia nigra pars compacta that's most directly affected. Rather than as opposed to the reticulata. And so there's an accumulation of, one way to think of it is it's like there's an accumulation of some sort of gunk, sort of like what happens in Alzheimer's disease, inside of neurons over time. And that gunk is called Lewy bodies. So last thing, so the substantia nigra sends signals to several parts of the brain, but perhaps its favorite part of the brain that it sends signals to is called the striatum or striatum. I've heard people pronounce it both ways. The striatum is a large part of the brain that is sort of towards the front, and don't worry about like all these words or even the anatomy necessarily. No need to remember these terms. Not going to be particularly edifying for most people, but the point is that one part of the brain sends dopamine to another part of the brain, and if the part of the brain that sends the dopamine ceases sending that dopamine, then the recipient of that dopamine will be lacking dopamine, right? So there's a loss of a dopaminergic signal. Okay, so here are some pictures of what Lewy bodies look like in the substantia nigra. So those darker, sort of malicious-looking shapes are Lewy bodies. So the reason I bring all this up is to give you an idea of what's going on in Parkinson's disease. Just over time, neurons in a very specific part of the brain that happens to regulate movement start to accumulate some gunk that eventually starts to mess up their function, over time, and it takes time for that accumulation to occur, usually. And so the loss of those dopamine-producing neurons results in another part of the brain expecting to receive all of this dopamine being pretty much deprived of all of that anticipated dopamine. So, what's a potential cure for this loss of dopamine-producing neurons in this very specific part of the brain? What if we could just replace those neurons, make it as though they were never lost in the first place? Well, this group in Wisconsin, working with rodents, showed that neurons that were produced from stem cells were able to integrate into those specific parts of the brain that are known to be implicated in Parkinson's disease. So not only do they increase the number of cells that are there, they actually seem to integrate and form connections that they would need to make. And so I couldn't dive into the full study quite yet, but the group was able to demonstrate that the implantation of these embryonic stem cell derived dopamine neurons in the substantia nigra or striatum of rodents resulted in the neurons forming the connections that they need to make to basically heal the damage that's induced by Parkinson's disease. So, to be more specific, like the stem cells that they implanted formed the anatomical connections that would be necessary to bring the brain of somebody with Parkinson's disease closer to the brain of somebody without. So the study is more complicated, and they, in fact, use the same technique that I used for my thesis work in their experiments, some of their experiments. But the point is that, they produced some evidence that it was the presence of the stem cells that was relieving or stem cell-derived neurons that was relieving the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And so that's super cool, right? So this group identified some specific biological evidence that the implantation of stem cells produced some functional neurons right where they were expected to be, forming the connections in the rest of the brain that they'd be expected to connect if it was working. Okay, and I think it's worth acknowledging that, while this experiment was conducted in an animal model, there's actually a human experiment going on right now as we speak. And it's a pretty crazy story that's been covered in several press outlets. Oops, where are we going? There we go. And I suggest you check out the one on Stat News, which is, by the way, Stat News is one of the best media outlets for science-related news, like by far at this point. They're doing excellent journalism. And it reads sort of like a thriller, like the article, but it's a true story. They definitely jazz it up a little bit, but it's a great read. So here's the short story of what's going on. There was a race to get the cells derived from the skin of a specific patient with Parkinson's disease to an operating room before they were no longer viable, right? They're only going to be alive or viable cells for only so long. And so, to be specific, they had fewer than 8 hours to get these cells from Boston to Manhattan. And so, to be clear, totally clear, this was a clandestine operation. Evidently there had been a small community of stem cell biologists that were interested, and it makes sense why, in the prospect of treating Parkinson's with stem cells. And it turns out there was an attempt, right, in September of 2017. And I've actually talked about this story before, but the shorter story is a former physician who specialized in internal medicine, think like House, who ended up developing a really important tool that physicians use regularly, developed Parkinson's disease, came down with the disease. And so this rather wealthy former physician was, confronting this rather tragic condition or disease for which there is really no effective cure, no effective, there's some treatments, but they're largely palliative. So this isn't the first time that scientists have explored, a replacement of those dopamine neurons in the substantia nigra as a potential treatment for Parkinson's. It was even attempted in the 80s, but it was a completely different approach that didn't produce particularly stellar results. And so this former physician, right, who had become rather successful and came down with Parkinson's, he ended up finding a basic neuroscientist who was working in stem cell biology in the brain. And he decided to personally fund his research to the tune of several $1 million, which it's not the most common way that this kind of research is funded. Sometimes private individuals will fund this kind of research, but it's kind of unusual. Not only that, but this physician who came down with Parkinson's found a world-class neurosurgeon who was willing to conduct the operation and infuse the stem cells that this neuroscientist had generated in the brain. So it's this collaborative effort between a basic neuroscientist and a surgeon, and then this guy who wanted to sort of turbocharge this research so that he could potentially benefit from it. And so there's this whole sort of regulatory rigmarole. And the FDA signed off on a compassionate use protocol, enabling this whole thing to go down. So there were a bunch of issues that resulted in the cells that were being produced in the lab in one part of the country, while the surgery was conducted in another part of the country, but it ended up going down in September of 2017, and they infused 4 million stem cells. So what makes this stat article so good is that they include the fact that basically any perturbation of pretty much any part of the brain can produce a very significant change in the activity of those brain regions, right? It doesn't have to be damage to brain regions. Just having a syringe physically, in a brain region can produce a major change in neurotransmitter release. I've seen it many times to my chagrin and frustration. But, so if your goal is to increase dopamine release, right, which is fundamentally what the goal is, and you think you're going to achieve it by creating more dopamine neurons, right, that's the goal, by infusing these neural progenitor cells into a specific part of the brain that's known to produce dopamine. Well, take it from me, putting literally anything in the area code of those dopamine producing neurons will cause them to react pretty radically. And so your goal is to achieve this elevated dopamine, but your real goal is sustained elevation of dopamine release, due to the integration of these cells into that dopamine producing brain region. But over the short term, that initial, just the surgery itself, can produce results in the short term that look quite a bit like your goal. They're releasing more dopamine, but it could just be because of the surgery itself and not because there's new neurons there. All right, so where are we today, right? That was 2017. After this stem cell surgery that was performed 3 years ago, as of May of this year, Lopez, who is the physician who developed Parkinson's, continues to take the same medications that he was taking for Parkinson's before this operation. And there are specific, there are some specific examples of possible improvements. He, I think when spearfishing and, he did a bunch of activities that, he was too debilitated to engage prior to this surgery. And the article, highlights things. Oh yeah, and tying shoelaces and stuff like that can be rather challenging if you have Parkinson's. But STAT does a good job of noting that these improvements are self-reported, right? So it's not like there was some physician or scientist who was as objectively as possible, assessing any improvements in capabilities or, attenuation of symptoms of Parkinson's. And so, this guy who underwent this procedure that he essentially self-funded, right, is, reporting positive outcomes. Doesn't mean, that they're wrong, that we shouldn't believe them. It just means that we should, be sort of, optimistically skeptical of what, he's telling us. And, okay. And also, it's not like a great reason to be overly confident in the viability of treating Parkinson's with these stem cells quite yet. But all that, all of those caveats aside, one of the neurosurgeons said, quote, "We didn't cure him of Parkinson's. I like to think we stabilized him." So in other words, preventing a continued deterioration due to Parkinson's. And, so we're all going to be keeping an eye out for updates on this patient, who received a rather experimental stem cell treatment for Parkinson's. But, the paper we discussed first, that basic neuroscience paper, can give us an idea of what might be possible with cells that can generate novel anatomical connectivity, right? We have good reasons to suspect that this may very well work. And if so, that would be a completely novel treatment for Parkinson's. Okay, there was another study that caught my eye, a totally different kind of study, maybe a little bit more fun, I don't know, quite a bit less detailed. So last week we talked a fair bit about dreams. Specifically, somebody called in who's been having pretty frequent lucid dreams. Specifically, and he was working towards trying to increase the frequency of lucid dreams, a concerted effort. So a study came out recently that caught my eye, and it's not really the kind of science that I find the most attractive. There's no actual biological mechanism identified or anything like that. It's purely psychology. But it's interesting, and I think worth discussing, just given the conversation we had last week about dreams. And so I noted that my dreams seem to have become unusually vivid, lately. Like, it's not like I'm having, nightmares or anything. In fact, none of them have been nightmares. I'm just remembering my dreams and remembering quite a bit more regularly, night after night. And I'm remembering the dreams at a resolution that's pretty unusual. Remembering the overall plot and trajectory of the dream, as well as minimal details, what the floor felt like on my bare feet in a building I entered, or what the wind felt like flowing over my face. I do sleep with the fan on, so I imagine my brain was just sort of integrating that sensory input, but still, it's just not the level of detail that I typically remember. So that's why this study caught my eye. It's about dreams. So Cassidy McKay and Teresa DeCicco, I think is how you pronounce it, DECICCO. They're at Trent University in Canada. They put out a paper that suggests that COVID-19 has had an effect on the quality of people's dreams. And it looks like, honestly, insider's perspective, it looks like that research team had been planning to conduct a bigger study, but basically everything else, COVID-19 smashed those plans until they had to adapt. And so, if I'm being honest about how I see the study, it seems to me that this group was doing whatever they could to produce a scientific publication with the data that they already had at the time. Because in basic science, as in psychology, if you're not regularly, publishing, it can imperil your career. So, and I only bring this up just because I think it's worth acknowledging that this group almost certainly didn't set out to do this research initially, but it doesn't mean the research is flawed or anything. Some of the most important discoveries were the product of serendipity, but just worth acknowledging. Anyway, so with all that said, here's what they did. They studied 19 Trent University students who were enrolled in psychology, in some course in psychology. The majority, 68%, were women, and of course 32% were men, and the study participants were pretty young, as students, between the ages of 18 and 25. Just over 10% were between 26 and 30 years old, and then 5% between 31 and 35, and then another 5% were 36 years or older. So you can, it sort of skews rather young, but there's some other age groups that are represented. And so they use something called the Hall Van de Kassel coding system to evaluate the content of dreams. And so basically, my understanding is that it's a way to quantify dreams, and it uses things like settings, objects, people, animals, strange creatures, mythological creatures, emotions, sexual content, things like that. Just, how frequently are these, features of a dream occurring in any given person. And so the participants, the people being studied, used dream journals between February 24th and March 12th of this year. And so, the data for these, for the study, though, were collected between March 9th and March 13th. Okay. So they had this long dream journal, but the study focused on this specific segment. And so the team compared the dreams recorded from this group to a control group that were matched for age and gender. And so as you can see, it's worth noting that like this phase of the pandemic, like when they were collecting these data, early March to mid-March, was most definitely before the virus really started spreading super rapidly, which in Canada was towards the end of March. So it looks like, the first main new case, first peak of new cases in Canada was like in early May. Right. But by the way, I think it's worth acknowledging that it looks like there's pretty much a second peak that's threatening to return. So that's when the study was conducted. And I think it might be safe to say that at least in the minds of these students, the prospect of enduring what we've all had to endure in an attempt to mitigate the spread of this virus was still like kind of theoretical, and it hadn't like tangibly hit them yet, so like the emotional landscape of the minds of these students hadn't quite been sculpted, right, by like actual personal experiences of the pandemic. It was more of a sort of nebulous and abstract set of expectations that were being set by like public health specialists and immunologists who are like trying to tell everybody, hey, this is what it's going to be like, buckle down. So the group hypothesized that the students would exhibit changes in the dreams that might reflect amplified anxiety, and they were and they're claiming that that's what their data suggest, that increased frequencies of like virus related dream content, things like that. They claim the students' dreams seem to reflect like increased general anxiety and like the stress of like an impending health crisis. And so just to be clear, like I'm not a huge fan of this kind of research. I've talked about some of the research into like the genesis of dreams and the limitations of like how much we should really invest in the content of dreams as being some kind of like revelation of really anything. But they highlight several past studies that have shown that consistent forms of dream content are tied to specific health related outcomes. And I can't really competently like criticize or scrutinize this whole like foundation of research. And I admit to being pretty reflexively skeptical, given what we know about the biology underlying dreams. But my own perspective and anecdotal experience is that over the past several months of the like truly atrocious response to COVID-19 in the United States, my dreams are consistently far more vivid. And there have been a bunch of pretty radical changes in my life and career recently. So who's to say that it's specifically the efforts to like flatten the curve that have really had like a unique effect on what couldn't be recapitulated by like similar inflection points in a person's life and career, coupled with like increased social isolation and frustration. Like it doesn't necessarily have to be COVID-19 specific. Can't know for sure. And once again, this isn't really my wheelhouse, but the fact that this team found increased markers of anxiety-related imagery among a group of young people is like both unsurprising to me, and also perhaps portends some psychology that may arise among a cohort of young people who've like endured a really unique and pretty disastrous phase in recent human history. Like in many ways, it seems like COVID-19 has like highlighted opportunities for us adults to improve the ways we manage our countries, both domestically as well as like how we all collaborate to confront challenges like this internationally. All right, so that's what I have for you this week. Hey Aiden, great Sunday content. Pretty much like always. Okay, my question. I know one Australian boy who plays Fortnite 24/7, and that's basically all he knows in life. What's wrong with him? Is there something wrong with his brain or something? No, I mean, I certainly don't think there's something wrong with him. He's not alone in spending sort of an inordinate amount of time playing video games, and specifically that video game. That video game is like shockingly popular, and video game designers like intentionally craft their games to have like addictive features to them. Like we know not only video games but like social media as well. We know that like companies like YouTube, like Twitter, Facebook, they like have worked with neuroscientists, behavioral neuroscientists, to craft specific components of their platforms to like tickle the sort of erogenous zones of our consciousness. Everything from how certain content is amplified, generally speaking more emotional content, but then even if you use Twitter, to see if you have new notifications. It is like intentionally designed to be like a slot machine. Like you're pulling down, hey, you don't know if there's going to be a reward, and a reward in the form of notifications. That is a well-established way to have a bunch of different animals just regularly engage. It's called intermittent reward. So like it's unpredictable. You don't really know when you're going to get the reward. Sometimes you get a big reward. Sometimes you don't get anything. And so you just keep trying because, hey, maybe the next time, I'll have notifications or something. Video games are no different. In fact, they're almost certainly far more engaging. So yeah, I mean, as a parent of a 1.5-year-old, she's a bit over 1.5 at this point, but there's just an opportunity cost there. That's really it. There's nothing like at least from what I've seen in the research, there's nothing intrinsically deleterious about playing video games. It's just, what is it at the expense of, right? What kind of stimulation are you substituting and losing by spending so much time playing that game? And to be like, there are things that you can learn and you can improve on by playing video games, like reaction time, social reasoning. That studies have shown that like it's not exclusively deleterious, but it's just the opportunity cost. And I certainly wouldn't take that as an indication that there's anything wrong with him. Okay. Yeah, I have to imagine, particularly these days, like I'm sure kids are playing a lot of video games. All right, let's go live. Are we off to the races here? I can't quite tell. Anyways, my name is Ian McLaughlin. I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania, where I studied the neurobiology of addiction and anxiety, trying to map out specific neurons in the brain, a circuit in the brain that's over 350 million years old, that's known to be involved in the withdrawal symptoms from alcohol, opioids, and stimulants, nicotine, and so I was trying to see if maybe that circuit was also involved in anxiety, which is one of the withdrawal symptoms from all of those drugs, independently of drug withdrawal. And so on YouTube, I just talked about a couple things. The most interesting, or maybe the most thorough, was a story about a new potential treatment for Parkinson's disease using stem cells. So not only did I talk about some basic neuroscience that was conducted to try and establish how if and how they could potentially be useful treatments for Parkinson's. And then I also talked about this like crazy story of basically like a secret operation that took place to treat somebody using stem cells. It's sort of like a thriller. That's kind of how it reads. So yeah, wait, what's going on here? Okay, what are your thoughts on ibogaine? Oh, and you can find the YouTube channel by going to youtube.com/anthropoid. Let's see. Seems like there might be something wrong right now, although perhaps not. Let's see. Yeah, it looks like it's not connecting. Let me try this again. Let me just make sure. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna try this again. Sorry, YouTube. I'm sure this is thrilling stuff. Please call the police. Oh, this is good. All right. And we'll do this. And we'll do this. And we'll do this. All right. Let's see if this works. Let's see. All right. My name is Ian McLaughlin. I have a PhD in neuroscience. And this looks like it's working better. And I studied addiction. I tried to map out. So I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania, where I worked on trying to map out the neurobiology of a specific circuit in the brain that's over 350 million years old, evolutionarily speaking, that we know is involved in the withdrawal from alcohol, opioids, nicotine, stimulants. And my question was whether or not the anxiety that most people experience, or all people experience when they're undergoing withdrawal from regular use of those drugs, it can be overlaid on the anxiety that has, totally independently of drug withdrawal. On YouTube, I just talked about two things. Well, a couple things. The first is a story, a recent study that came out that may help us to understand if and how stem cells might be used to treat Parkinson's disease. There's some good evidence now that they would do what we would want them to do. I also talked about this, crazy story of like a secret surgery that went on to treat a human using stem cells, and sort of what the status of that is. It was done 3 years ago. I also talked about dreams and COVID-19. There's a interesting tiny little study that came out, and since we talked so much about dreams last week, caught my eye. Hello. Hey, what's up, Abyss? Good to see you, man. Vanessa, hello. I have a question that is very extremely important for me. Feel free. Ask you anything. What came first, the egg or the chicken? I know you're trying to stump me with that question, but there's an answer to that question. That is not a paradox. So what came first? Think evolution, right? If you think about how chickens evolved, presumably from reptiles from way back in the day, at some point there was some chicken-like thing that laid an egg that had a chicken in it. So the egg came first. Okay, is it nature or nurture when it comes to human intelligence? Linnick the Hunter. So nature and nurture. Generally speaking, pretty much any question that you can ask in neuroscience, not all of them, some exceptions, the answer is going to be both. It's going to be nature and nurture. And particularly when it comes to more complicated, distributed processes like human intelligence. It's not like human intelligence is just a byproduct of activity in one very specific part of the brain and, just like one gene. When it comes to certain things that, there are certain diseases, for example, that are just the product of nature. In other words, the environment didn't have to predispose or cause somebody to develop it. Which is the case for things like cancer. But like Rett syndrome is the byproduct of just a mutation in one specific gene, and we know what the gene is, and it produces something that looks kind of like autism, or a lot like autism. So when it comes to intelligence, for example, if, it's difficult to define intelligence. That makes this conversation rather difficult because different people have different ideas of what intelligence is. Is it the ability to do math really, really fast and really, really accurately? Is it the ability to play the piano, at world-class proficiency? I would argue those are both forms of human intelligence. But the IQ test doesn't really test for, that musical prowess. Anyway, so it involves a whole bunch of different skills and different brain regions as a result. And, if somebody is born with a predisposition to being really, really good at computation, but they're never taught how to, any arithmetic, any math, then it's going to be difficult for them to, for that intelligence to manifest. So it's nature and nurture. Oh my God, what's up, Luciforin? Is depression a necessary evolutionary tool? Like to make us pause and focus, ruminate. That's Seattle Anai, I think is how you'd pronounce that. It's an interesting thought. Here's how I half agree with that. But here's how I would reframe it. So rather than being an evolutionary, an adaptive evolutionary component, it's almost certainly the byproduct of other aspects of our neurobiology that happens to also generate a predisposition to depression. Here's what I mean by that. For example, rumination, as you note, is a sort of hallmark symptom of depression, where people just cannot stop thinking about, certain aversive negative experiences and just going over and over, and they can't really escape this thought loop, this rumination. Now, picture Homo sapiens in the savannas of Africa, way back, hundreds of thousands of years ago. That predisposition to regularly, to repeatedly evaluate a given experience, back then maybe it was running away from a lion or whatever, something like that, or like an interaction with another potential mate, it could be the case that being predisposed to just going back over and over and over these experiences might prepare you to be, better in that situation in the future. Now, the world experiences of Homo sapiens back in those days wasn't nearly as complicated as it is today. And so as a result, what might have been adaptive back then now becomes not necessarily, a disadvantage, but a predisposition to something pathological. And, that when it comes to like mental illnesses, psychiatric conditions, I think that sort of framework explains a lot of them. Because our brain is essentially the same as those humans thousands and thousands of years ago in the savannas of Africa, but our experiences are significantly different these days, and so that same old ancient organ is being applied to completely novel situations. I doubt depressed people are less productive and therefore less likely to reproduce. I definitely, I think you'd be hard pressed to portray depression as an adaptive advantage. Okay, do I use X39 patches for stem cell rejuvenation? I do not. I didn't undergo any kind of stem cell treatment, by the way. And also, these studies that I talked about on YouTube, again, it's youtube.com/anthropoid. I talked about the prospect of using stem cells to treat Parkinson's disease. And but I talked about this story, really, of an experimental, secret, clandestine operation to infuse, I think, 4 million stem cells into the specific part of the brain that is affected by Parkinson's disease. And it's a wild story. But anyways, you can check it out, youtube.com/anthropoid. And I bring all that up to emphasize that this is still not evidence that anybody should go out and independently pursue any kind of stem cell treatment for something like that. We're not quite there yet. All right. No, my pleasure for answering that topic. How does copper factor into stem cell and old broken cell crapola in the body cleaning? How does copper? I've never seen copper being highlighted as a particularly consequential factor in cell differentiation. I mean, it could be perhaps involved in some kind of biochemical pathway, but it wouldn't be the things that I think you're thinking about, like the types of molecules that can make stem cell differentiation work, or stem cells, the thing that guides how they become other cells, like in this case neurons. Those are mostly hormones and what are called neurotrophic factors, chemotactic factors, these complicated molecules that signal to the stem cell okay, so start to develop this organelle, start to develop these projections, and just one element basically isn't going to be sufficient. Okay, what effects do vape pens have on people? All right, I don't know, I guess I shouldn't tell this story. But let me put it this way. I saw something pretty funny on the floor of the New Jersey Assembly. I was sort of oh, wow, okay. Anyway, so vaping and vape pens, I think, is a really complicated topic. Just because I think a lot of people instinctually have an oppositional reaction to them. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, not the least of which being that in America, at least, we have a pretty prohibitionist sort of vibe, right? Generally speaking, the use of pretty much any drug is seen as a negative thing, and vape pens, of course, are the whole point is that they deliver a drug, nicotine perhaps more commonly, but then also sometimes cannabinoids. And then also the fact that Juul, specifically the company that makes, I think, by far the most popular vape, e-cig vape device, has been shown to have been intentionally pursuing increased usage among adolescents, which would, is theoretically illegal. And, basically we can attribute this dramatic rise in vaping to almost entirely that company. And that's a problem for sure. That said, cigarettes and tobacco remains one of the, if not the leading cause of preventable death in the world. And there's a lot of good evidence to suggest that responsibly produced e-cigs, e-cig liquid specifically, is less deleterious to health than smoke. And such that in the United Kingdom, it was actually recommended that people specifically try and use e-cigs to quit smoking, because a fairly large proportion of the UK population smokes. So that was their recommendation. Now in the United States, again, we have this more sort of prohibitionist kind of reflex instinct. That sort of model has not been embraced, to say the least. And in fact, it sounds like the executive branch of the government seems still pretty motivated to basically outlaw at least flavored nicotine delivery, electronic nicotine delivery systems. One final problem here is that for a very long time, e-cigs were sort of like a gray market kind of set of products. And so you had e-cig there was no like giant company that was producing e-cig liquids. A lot of them were like sort of small establishments, oftentimes in China, but sometimes in the US, where people were just making them sort of in their kitchen, basically. Like there's no quality control. And so it was shown that certain flavorants, some of the molecules that are used to make e-cig liquid taste like bacon or popcorn, turned out that at the temperatures at which e-cigs heat or to which e-cigs heat the e-liquid, some of those molecules underwent combustion essentially and burned. Completely defeating the point of using an e-cig, which is to vaporize nicotine rather than burn something that holds nicotine. And so it was just those flavorants were dangerous. Also, some of the quality of the e-cigs, usually vegetable glycerin or polyethylene glycol, that's like what the actual goo is into which flavorants and nicotine are put. There wasn't stringent quality control for that either, and so as a result, some e-cig liquids were shown to have things like acetone in them. Not because anybody put the acetone in there, but because some of the molecules, when they reached those temperatures, were converted into like acetone or like various aldehydes, not acetone, aldehydes. So that, all of that is a problem, but it's a solvable problem, right? And, we just need the FDA or the USDA, whatever, to regulate this industry, do quality control, evaluations, ensure that, hey, this company, and Juul, I think, is a multi-billion-dollar company, just Juul. And a lot of other companies are owned by like Philip Morris or whatever. If you ensure high quality control, and you're stringently, making sure that these things don't damage, don't have unintended, toxic components, then I think it is a little bit reckless to suggest that people should not vape at all. For the past, let's say, as of 2 years ago, for the preceding 5, 10, 15 years, e-cigs were seen as a way to quit smoking by public health people. I actually wrote a paper about that. And that was just one part of it. So anyways, all this said, I think we should embrace e-cigs as an opportunity to help more people quit smoking. Tobacco is absolutely associated with more, at least it's been shown, to be associated with more negative health outcomes. And we just have to do it the right way and don't deprive people of this opportunity to help, quit smoking. There is another device out there called, I always forget, it's like IQOS, I think, or something like that. It's basically like a vaporizer that you attach to a cigarette, and I think that Philip Morris is putting that out. And that wouldn't even be, necessarily superior. So yeah, I know that was a really long answer. The short answer is that they're addictive, just like cigarettes. But there are fewer molecules in e-cigs than there are in tobacco. So nicotine is not the only psychoactive component of tobacco. There are other ones, some of which are MAOIs. Monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So that's why even if people are vaping with super high percentage of nicotine and they just quit smoking, they do still experience withdrawal. It's kind of fascinating, right? All right, that was a much longer response than you were looking for. Let's see what's up. I think I can see Deanna Hooper's in here. If you don't know, Deanna Hooper is also a scientist, an even harder scientist than I am. She studies dark matter. She studies the coolest parts of the universe, and she's very, very nice too. So you should check her out. She does this kind of thing, and you can ask her questions like, but where do black holes come from though? But where did the universe come from though? And she has to deal with those complicated questions. You can also ask her about quantum physics, which I know a lot of people are interested in. Do you like the porn movie? Well, it depends on which porn movie. I'm not just across the board gonna like all porn. Get out of here. That's ridiculous. That's banana pants. Talking crazy. All All right. Hi, a brain scientist. Yeah. Pedophile Netflix. That's not the kind of Netflix I enjoy. Can anybody reach 100% of their brain capacity? Felipe, you are the one, ding, 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 that brought up that myth. It's one of my favorite myths, and I'm being a little bit sarcastic. It's a zombie myth. No, first of all, nobody uses 100% of their brain, because if somebody did, they would die from the most epic of epic seizures. Not only that, but you wouldn't even want to use, well, and for that reason, you wouldn't want to use 100% of your brain. And, you know, the flip side of that myth is that we only use 10% of our brain, or, you know, there's different numbers, usually 10%. Like, you know, humans can only use 10% of their brain, and if we could only use more of it, then we would be able to move things with our mind. And, you know, like, you know, what is it, Limitless or Lucy, those movies where the fundamental science fiction was that they took a pill or something and it enabled them to, you know, access to 100% of the brain. It's just not how it works. Right now, the percent of your brain that's active is fluctuating actually very, very rapidly. And broadly speaking, if you're trying to be really good at anything, what you don't want is more brain activity happening. The better you are at anything, archery, you know, musical instruments, whatever, pick your skill. The better you are, the less brain activity there is. Because if you imagine, if you're, you know, trying to fire an arrow and hit a bullseye, and instead of just having specifically the neurons that control just those specific muscles that enable you to very gracefully and smoothly hit the bullseye, if instead of that you have neurons that are associated with, like, remembering your first kiss, what Oreos taste like, like, if you were just thinking about all this other stuff, then, you know, you wouldn't be able to hit the bullseye. You'd be so distracted. So, solvable, yeah. We don't need any vape cigarettes. Certainly we don't need them. What are some similarities between cannabis and alcohol on influencing the brain? Abdul. That's a great question. First of all, obviously these are, you know, rather different drugs. They're both psychoactive. They share that, so they can both cross the blood-brain barrier. Or not cannabis itself. Nobody's putting plants into their brain. But the molecules in cannabis can gain access to the brain. Not many molecules can do that because of our blood-brain barrier. So they're both similar on that count. But more importantly, cannabis, alcohol, opioids, pretty much any drug that anybody does for fun or voluntarily has at least one thing in common, and that is that they elevate levels of dopamine release in a part of the brain, circuit in the brain called the mesolimbic, it's really the mesocortical limbic, but the mesolimbic dopaminergic circuit. This is a circuit that evolved to help us to determine if we want to do anything, if we want to do something, and for how long we want to do it. And so it is like, you know, maybe the most critical component of what we would refer to as willpower, right? The decision to engage in any behavior. That circuit is sort of fundamental to that capability. Alcohol increases dopamine there. Cannabis, the cannabinoids in cannabis will increase dopamine release, and that's true for opioids. It's true for pretty much any drug that people do, and it kind of makes sense, right? These are molecules that are sort of turning up the volume on the very circuit that evolved to help us to decide if and when and for how much we do anything. So they share that in common. They share other things in common too, like alcohol. It has very, very messy pharmacology. It doesn't just hit one specific receptor, but among the myriad of receptors that alcohol tickles are GABA receptors. And cannabinoids, of course, they bind endocannabinoid receptors in the brain and actually in the periphery as well. But part of the byproduct of that binding, very frequently, is through something called retrograde transmission, or retrograde inhibition in this case, amplifies GABAergic activity. So it sort of like calms down activity in many circuits. This isn't true across the board. Sometimes it can increase release of various neurotransmitters, but they share some GABAergic activity. And they're both addictive, I should note. You know, there's this, people have a lot of motivated reasoning when it comes to cannabis just because of how insane and ridiculous our drug laws are with regards to cannabis in the United States. And so I think people are just predisposed to exaggerate how benign or, how benign or even beneficial cannabis is. Pretty much any drug that has that pharmacological activity that elevates dopamine levels can be addictive. And it just so happens that the withdrawal syndrome from cannabis is just not as severe as pretty much any other drug. And so as a result, people just say it's not addictive. Well, that's not true. In fact, cannabis is one of the leading causes, cannabis addiction, let's say, is one of the leading causes of people being admitted to, clinical consultation for addiction. People seek, help to quit cannabis very, very frequently. That said, alcohol addiction is more severe, and it's one of the handful of drugs that induce a potentially fatal withdrawal syndrome. Oh wow, Euromaestro is calling in. Very cool. Let's see if we can connect. There was something wrong with my thing earlier. So are we connected, Euromaestro?
We are. Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm hanging in there. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I wanted to ask you a question, but it's not even my question. It's a question from one of the people in your comments here.
Oh, cool.
And I know that you're so good at your answering people's questions, and so many comments fly by in the meantime. So it was just a question I thought was interesting. So it's by @GravityIsFake. and he asks, if consciousness emerges as the result of neuronal activity, there can be no free will. Agree? So that was an interesting question.
I agree. It is an interesting question. And the short story is, yes, I agree. At least as far as, if we are going to accept the kind of probably the most common perception of what free will is, you can get different kinds of definitions from different people. But if we stipulate that, free will is just your next decision, your next experience, your next conscious thought is completely unencumbered by any, restrictive, factor, then no, that's just not how the brain works. And so if you are a determinist and you embrace the brain as the thing that generates consciousness, then it's very difficult to find a justification for free will. What do you think, Euro?
Well, I would struggle with it because if it comes from neuronal activity or anything that would classically be described as deterministic, it's hard to understand how that could be free will in the way that we understand it. But I'm just wondering, thinking about philosophically, do you think there is any way you could have an emergent property that develops and somehow it could have free will in the emergent state? Well, somehow separate from the components that make it up.
Sure. Yeah, I know what you mean. In other words, what Euro is describing is an emergent phenomenon is a thing that is generated that is greater than the sum of its parts. So here is, I think, the only reasonable argument in favor of free will that I've seen. And basically what they have to do, though, is they have to redefine free will. So basically, if we just decide that, we're just going to consider what it is that happens in the brains of humans, free will, well, then everything changes, right? If you're just, if you are considering that all of that, all of that brain activity, subconscious brain activity that sort of bubbles up towards your conscious awareness, if you're just going to, over which you have zero control, it's, largely the byproduct of the genes you've inherited that sculpt, the brain you develop, as well as, the society into which you were born, your parents, how they raised you. If you're just going to call that free will, well, then fine. Okay. And that is an important feature of a philosophical perspective framework called compatibilism. But for me, I think that's just kind of a game of semantics. And, I think it's...
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah.
That would be semantics. But how do you solve the issue that we do have the illusion of free will?
Yeah.
So it appears to us that we have free will.
Yeah.
So where does that illusion come from then?
Yeah, well, that is that's a giant question. I don't know that we even have the answer for that. People have said that there may be an evolutionary benefit to perceiving every decision that you make as free. I've seen some arguments that you couldn't have a human consciousness that didn't feel like it was free, like it had free will. And so, just because we know, or, if you accept that it doesn't exist, just because that free will doesn't exist doesn't mean that it really doesn't change your personal behavior at all. Each moment seems like a new, a free moment where you can make a free decision. And just because you have no awareness or no control over the factors that got you there doesn't mean that it doesn't feel free. But yeah, I've never seen any studies that like pin down a specific physical substrate for that sensation of free will. Maybe somebody has. I don't know.
And Laidback Dre says to ask you if our brains receive information from the universe. And he says, for example, Nikola Tesla. So I don't know if you're familiar with what he's talking about.
If what you're talking about is like, so first of all, yes, the human brain does absolutely receive information from the universe in the form of our sensory systems, right? So, we I think a lot of us take vision kind of for granted, even though it's this incredibly complicated and beautiful system that enables us to get like moment to moment updates on what's going on in our environment, because it's essentially sensitive to something that moves at the speed of light, photons, right? And so we're receiving all this information from the universe because all these photons are bouncing off pretty much everything around you, and we happen to have these little receivers, photoreceptors, that can detect them. And the same goes for we have a molecule detector in the middle of our face, right, where we can tell if there's a molecule floating around that smells like strawberries or smells like fecal matter, right? And so what you're detecting there is like literally you have receptors that are binding those molecules that are floating around. And so we have chemodetectors. That's an update on from what's going on around us in the universe. What we do not have is something like an antenna that receives information in some metaphysical manner. We have our sensory systems, and we have the ability to craft novel sensory systems using technology. But that, at least for me, is beautiful enough. It's amazing that this exists, that this evolved. And there's, just because we don't have an antenna that's getting broadcasts from our alien overlords doesn't mean that that it's not pretty cool that we have eyeballs,
That is cool. Well, kind of related to this free will thing is like, what do we know about like decision making? So like we go through this process when we make decisions sometimes that we feel divided between different options, and it's almost like we're having a conversation or a debate in our head, and there's like part of us that wants to do one thing and a part wants to do another thing. Ultimately, you can only do one of them. So how does that work? Like, what are the sources of those different things, and how does one of those win out over the other?
Yeah, I love that topic. Like, another way to sort of phrase that is like, when you're debating with yourself, with whom are you debating? Who are you talking to? Right?
Exactly. That's what I'm getting. Like, what are all these different things? Because presumably, it's just one. We like to think of ourselves as one entity, yet we're carrying on this thing like, I want to go to the movies, I want to eat, I want to stay home. Like, what are those separate things that are saying stay home, go out?
Yeah, it's interesting. So one way to think about this, and okay, so decision making is a very complicated process, right? It's not like there's just one part of the brain that pulls the trigger on a given decision. Sometimes literally to pull the trigger. Rather, if you could think of human behavior, one way to think about it is like sort of like watching like an argument in Parliament in the UK, where like people start yelling, and this this MP is making an argument, no, we shouldn't open schools. This other one is saying, yes, we should open schools, and eventually one of them ultimately wins out for a variety of reasons. Well, in the brain there is this kind of competition between different signals. Like let's just take a very sort of maybe intuitive example, where you're standing in a social situation in a party or at a bar, and you see somebody that you find very attractive, right? And so you have this drive, your attraction, your reproductive system, your, pretty much everything about us that drives affection and that kind of thing is, telling or promoting a certain behavior to go talk to her. But then you have this anxiety system that's also generating, avoidance messages, right? Because, hey, what if she doesn't like you? What if she thinks you're stupid? What if you say the wrong thing? And so, that competition is happening. Now, there is a part of the brain called the anterior cingulate, which is a pretty big part of the brain, and it's involved in a huge variety of things. But one of the things that some research has shown that it can do is that it receives a lot of these disparate competing signals, and then, it's not quite this simple, but the signal that has the highest signal strength is the one that ultimately wins out. So just to give you make it a little bit more tangible. So you have this anxiety system, right, that's sending signals to the anterior cingulate. And then you also have, all these desire, reward, mechanisms that are also sending signals. And if it just so happens that because of a past experience, you've been slapped in the face like 4 times by different women, that the anxiety signal is just a bit higher because there's all these, there's the memories, there's the sensation of being slapped, all of those things combine to generate a certain signal strength. And if your desire for reproduction essentially isn't high enough, then the anxiety wins out and you don't go up to that girl. So it's a competition of a bunch of different combinations of signals that all converge, and you see which one wins.
And the intensity of those signals may be determined by previous experiences that could cause something. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I have heard about studies where when they're trying to look at this decision-making process and they're reading our brain activity, that they can actually sense the decision we're going to make just slightly prior to the person is aware of having made the decision.
Yeah, so first of all, yes, that research absolutely exists, and I think Benjamin Lebet was one of the first scientists to do it, but there's a bunch of others, that have sort of come up with different models. And by the way, it has become a little bit more contentious recently. There are, there's been some scrutiny of that research suggesting that actually, but they weren't truly predicting what the person was going to do. I would have to review the specifics of that scrutiny, but I've only seen a criticism of specifically Lebet's research. But there are definitely studies that have shown that yes, a scientist using fMRI, or usually a combination of fMRI in some other imaging platform, can predict which button they're going to choose between 2 different buttons, that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah, and so yeah.
Exactly that kind of thing. And it's just slightly before the time that the person thinks that they made the decision, which is quite interesting because it kind of gives credence to this whole deterministic type of thing that, perhaps that there isn't really this free will, and that's just sort of an illusion that your perception that you give to that activity that's taking place.
100%. Yeah, I mean, and that is just one body of evidence to confirm that we don't have free will in the way that we popularly conceive of it, and it doesn't. Even if that research isn't accurate and it is shown to they're not predicting it, or whatever, it just wasn't an optimal experimental framework. Even if if that happens, right, and all that research is scrutinized and shown to be inadequate, free will still, just given how we know how the brain works, there's still not a lot of reason to believe in free will.
Well, that's awesome. Well, thanks so much for entertaining those questions, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate your broadcast. I'm glad that you continue to do them and take the time to share your knowledge with us.
Oh, thank you so much, Eero. It's awesome to talk to you, and it is my pleasure, but it's also therapeutic for me. I don't think I would have finished my PhD, nor would I still be moderately sane if I wasn't able to talk to people, particularly right now. So thanks so much for calling in, man. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, cheers. Bye-bye.
It's Eero Maestro, everybody. An OG on this platform, I should say. Oh, you know what I should do? Wait, where are we? Oh, cool. Okay. All right. I see Daryl's in here. Good to see you, man. I don't know why I put the screen over here. That must be so weird to just look at the side of my head. I want to send you into a church. I growing up, I went to, I was in a church pretty much every day of the week. So I've been there, done that, my friend. All right. So, and I suspect maybe you're bringing that up because it is true that, discussions of free will can really come up against spiritual convictions, religious beliefs. And so, of all of the topics that come up, free will is probably the one that touches everybody. And like nobody owns the debate, in terms of like discipline. Like philosophers can debate free will, just people with your instincts, can debate free will. It just so happens, I think, that knowledge of the brain can be a very, very helpful tool to bring to the table. Believing in science is like wearing shoes on your hands. You know what? My daughter loves wearing shoes on her hands. It is so weird. It doesn't matter whose shoe, what kind of shoe, sandal, baby shoe, Crocs. She's just immediately, she was like, take those off, put them on my hands, I'm running away. So maybe you're right, I don't know. But the thing is, you don't believe in science, right? That's not really how science works. Science is not an institution. Science is a method. It's a style of thinking. It's a framework to ask and do your best to answer questions objectively and remove your sort of personal bias. So it's like, it's like saying like, I don't believe in hammers. Like, it doesn't matter if you believe in hammers. They exist. It's just whether or not you want to use them. And, there are certain situations where it's appropriate to use a hammer. There are certain situations where science isn't necessarily the optimal tool. I think it happens to be a very, very versatile tool, but it's not, doesn't reign supreme on dual entities once a month. Please ask, based on our knowledge, is it more probable that a metaphysical realm exists or not? See, now that is where my training in science would fail you, because it's just not what I study. It's not where my expertise lies. My expertise is about the nature of consciousness, the human brain, up until all of that brain activity stops happening. Then I can't tell you what's going on. I mean, I can tell you biochemically what's going on, but I can't tell you what happens to your consciousness. I mean, I can tell you what I think, but my perspectives are equally, viable as yours, and spiritual teachers and stuff like that. I'm gonna do it, y'all. I'll be my first scope. Oh boy, good luck. Please do. Science is repeatable, repeatable, thus provable. That is a very, very important component of science, is reproducibility or repeatability. These are slightly different things. There's kind of a broad misunderstanding. People talk about this like replication crisis in science, and it's a misunderstanding. Like, I can't remember who wrote an article on this. I think in that's so frustrating. Maybe The Conversation or something. I can't remember which outlet, but basically, helping to define what repeatability and reproducibility are, and they're not the end-all be-all of any given study. Like, just because some other group hasn't yet been able to repeat the results of a given study doesn't mean that study is bad or wrong. So yeah, and yeah. What food would you recommend for brain enhancement? So canned sugar. That's not canned sugar. Don't eat that. In fact, there's really no good reason to eat sugar at all, frankly, unless you're like like a peak athlete, approaching peak performance. Sugar is there's really no good reason to eat simple carbohydrates like that. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that it's bad, that it's deleterious to health. It's associated with a lot of different things, even something like increased predispositions to dementia, and just a whole bunch of just deleterious things that inside the brain alone, let alone obesity and all that kind of stuff. So avoid sugar. Really, when it comes to the brain is an extraordinarily complicated organ. right? It's not like it just has a couple types of cells and they produce insulin or something and then that's all that they do, right? There's like tons and tons of different kinds of cells, tons and tons of different kinds of chemical reactions, biochemical reactions, genes being expressed, proteins being expressed, and all of those processes require a broad repertoire of nutrients, minerals, vitamins, minerals, proteins, fats, carbohydrates. So it's not like, oh, you should go and just spoon feed yourself cinnamon, right? Like that'll make your brain super healthy. Rather, having a competent distribution and a diverse distribution of nutrients and macronutrients like protein, carbohydrates and fat, and then a variable set of micronutrients like vitamins and stuff like that. That's your best bet, and change it up. But you don't really ever want to eat like if all you're eating is like Hot Pockets and Doritos, then you're just not getting a competent. You're getting food, you could survive, but you're not getting a competent distribution of nutrients. However, there is one thing that I've for years I've talked about, and I am, to give you a sense of how I approach this topic, I'm very skeptical of most supplements, most of that world, just because there's not a lot of evidence in that world, nor are they required to produce evidence that their products exist beyond just this doesn't have any arsenic in it. This won't kill somebody immediately. That said, there is some pretty solid evidence that turmeric, it's like a spice that's used, it's probably most closely associated with like curry, from India, but it's used in other things. Turmeric and curcumin, which is the component in turmeric that we think is responsible for the benefits, has been shown to be associated with just sort of a broad set of improvements in health, including reduced risks of dementia. And in fact, it's been evaluated as a potential treatment for dementia. I'm sure that clinical trial is probably over, so I should check it out. So turmeric is one, when I was living in a normal time in my life where I wasn't, dealing with a freaking pandemic like we all are. I would make smoothies, using like, green leafy vegetables, some fruit, that kind of stuff. I would throw in some turmeric. And whenever I make, anything except for steak in terms of protein, I'll add some turmeric. Another thing, it's not really a food, but there is a, of course. No, it's Elysium. Yeah. There's a company that is very, very interesting that is essentially, a pretty broad set of very senior scientists comprise its board of the people that lead the company called Elysium. And they are selling a supplement straight up, rather than selling it as a pharmaceutical for longevity, for extending lifespan and health span, like how you can live until you're 120, but if you're like bedbound and your consciousness is minimized, then is that really what you want? And so that's the concept of health span. It's just extending not only how long you live, but how healthy you are as you live longer. And so they're selling a product that's a combination of nicotinamide mononucleotide and pterostilbene or resveratrol. One of the leaders of this company, David Sinclair, is like one of the guys that kind of discovered resveratrol. Not only, he's I think like the director of human genetics or something at Harvard. And then the other main director, what's his name? That's like Gangitano. It's like, I can't remember his last name, but he's at MIT and he's also a very senior scientist. Anyways, they're selling this supplement as a longevity tool. And they're using the revenues from that supplement to fund more research into that topic. It's a really interesting model. It's never really been done before, not in earnest, and not by people like them. So that'll be interesting to follow. And there's other, Chromadex is one of their competitors. And there's a couple companies in this space, but that is a thing that I'm keeping my eye on because there is some really interesting research into NMN is how nicotinamide mononucleotide. There's also nicotinamide riboside. These are very similar molecules. Anyways, that's something I'm keeping my eye on. I wouldn't ever recommend somebody go out and buy it because it's actually kind of expensive, and at times it's hard to get. But that's something I'm keeping my eye on. But for now, focus on turmeric and then a competent, diverse diet. Resveratrol is from grapes. So resveratrol can be found in a lot of things, but yes, you're right, that it is most closely associated with specifically red wine and specifically the skin from red wine. Psilocybin trips therapeutic benefits. Well, yes, maybe is how, where we are with that topic, and we're far more yes maybe than we were today than we were in the past, and that is because some clinical trials have been conducted using psilocybin as a psychiatric treatment for I think it's specifically end of life trauma, like people who have terminal cancer and things like that, like rather severe specific depression. I think it's there are clinical trials using it for other things too, but in terms of like its psychoactive effects, those clinical trials have suggested that yes, indeed, there are some benefits there. Keep in mind, it's not like they're going into the woods and tripping, right? It's being administered by an experienced clinician, psychiatrist, and then there's also psychotherapy that accompanies it. So it's not just it's not just psilocybin alone. MDMA is, by the way, another. Yes, Guarente. Thank you so much, Hiro. That's awesome. Thanks, man. That was just burning the back of my brain, just trying to remember. So there's that. Now, another interesting benefit of psilocybin, however, is that some people who have cluster headaches, this is sort of, you can sort of think of it like a migraine, that are very, very severe and debilitating. It turns out that for some people for whom the sort of frontline treatments for headaches, migraines, and cluster headaches don't work, it turns out that sub-threshold, meaning like before it becomes psychedelic, so low doses of psilocybin can relieve them of those headaches. And it kind of actually makes sense. You might be sort of surprised, like, why would this thing that people, take at like Burning Man and like festivals like that, why would that be beneficial for headaches? Well, if you look at the pharmacology of the drugs that are used to treat migraines, various forms of very severe headaches, they're essentially all serotonergic. They all bind specific serotonin receptors that happen to, more often than not, regulate blood vessel constriction and dilation. And guess what psilocybin binds? Serotonin receptors. And so it just could be that, in some folks, the serotonergic signaling that causes their headaches to occur is optimally treated by targeting a slightly different set of receptors than, like standard migraine medications. So there's those two things. Ketamine causes swelling. I'm not sure what you mean by ketamine or swelling. Ketamine is another interesting treatment strategy for depression. Some people experience rather significant benefits and like lasting alleviation of their symptoms of depression. Some people don't. Like some people find it extraordinarily unpleasant. Oh, thanks for the super hearts. I really appreciate it. It's very generous of you. Okay, David Sinclair sold out. Yeah, well, kind of. Well, not really. I mean, there's no such thing as selling out as a scientist. Like, people make a big stink of, oh, this scientist went into industry. It's like, talk to me with all that kind of sanctimoniousness after you have a kid. Like, your decisions are not your own. Like, you have to make decisions that are in the best interest of your children. And if it just so happens that, you cannot support your child in academia, which is the case for a lot of scientists these days. I could go on forever and ever about that, by the way. But, then the only responsible decision is to go into industry. So, yeah, I'm just not a big fan of that, that kind of worldview in academia, that industry is like for, people who sell out or you don't. And by the way, there's a lot of misconceptions about private research, science that is done by private entities. Like a lot of people will say that like there's no creativity, you have no control over your projects. What, like academia, you do? You have to do a project that the NIH is going to fund, or the NSF, usually the NIH if you're in neuroscience, that Francis Collins has decided that he wants to fund, right? So it's just it's self-soothing. I think that whole like scientists, they sold out. It's like self-soothing to justify how rough it is in academia. That's pretty sick. Do you think he'll answer my IQ question? Oh, Sandra, I'm so sorry. Let's see if we can find it. Okay. Continue to pay. You sound uneducated. What? I'm actually interested to know what you personally think about a metaphysical realm. If it's okay, well, reach out on Twitter. Let's see. Okay. Like being in Texas. Thank you. Doctors never respond to my questions. Oh, I'm sorry about that. It's just really awkward to ask anything out of the box. Oh, yeah. Yeah, physicians are not scientists. I'll just leave it at that. This one is interesting for me. What is your definition of consciousness? Yeah, I mean, that is a very big topic. There are different definitions of consciousness. The way I think about it is consciousness is the emergent dynamic, the thing that the brain produces. It is the byproduct of a bunch of constituent parts that all contribute to weave a sort of tapestry of experience, of subjective experience that we call consciousness. And you can remove some of the fibers that comprise that tapestry, but you are then by definition altering the tapestry itself and removing components of the art. So that's how I think about it. It's an emergent property of the brain. Okay. Do you anything about spinal cord stimulators? Well, I mean, in general, sure. I mean, these are implanted electrodes essentially that are targeting, various components of the central nervous system, the spinal cord. And so, essentially it's like, the way that neurons in the nervous system work is the way they communicate with one another is electrochemical, right? So it's electrochemical signaling. Electro meaning electrical, essentially. It's a generating current. And then chemical meaning neurotransmitters. And so that's the language of neurons. And you can modify the consciousness. You can treat disorders and diseases of the brain by tapping into the chemical component of signaling using drugs, modifying neurotransmitter release and stuff like that. Or you can just directly go into the more and I should say the chemical component of electrochemical signaling is slower and it's generally more sustained, whereas the electrical is really fast, on millisecond timescales. And in some cases, there is no access point to treat a given malady through chemical signaling. You need to use electrical signaling. And so when it comes to, spinal cord stimulators are used for a bunch of different things. But you are just tapping into the electrical component of electrochemical signaling and modulating the activities of a specific set of neurons to achieve some desired effect, whether it's improved motor control. It can even be anorgasmia. There are spinal cord stimulators that are used to treat that. How is your little one? She's doing great. She is getting a little too smart for us, though. I really wish that she could go to daycare. It's really it's very deeply frustrating for me, and I assume I'm not the only parent out there that it's very frustrating. When you see people who refuse to wear masks or who decide to believe that this is a conspiracy theory, because all they're doing is indirectly they're harming my daughter because she can't go to school, she can't learn from experts, she can't hang out with other babies. And she can't socially develop. So it's a really, really self-centered and, by the way, also very stupid way to live. Can you talk about why we don't understand GABA receptor function very well? No, we do actually. The GABA receptor is one of the sort of foundational components of the chemical component of electrochemical signaling. So generally speaking, if you think of a synapse is a point of communication between two neurons or multiple neurons, right? And there's a little space called the synaptic cleft. And so, that is like the mouth. It doesn't really work now. Like the mouth and the ear, whatever. It's like the way that one neuron sends signals to another neuron and that neuron receives those signals. And so if you look at almost pretty much, if you just randomly picked a synapse, you're almost certainly going to see at least two neurotransmitters, usually multiple, GABA and glutamate. And you can think of those two, they're sort of like opposing neurotransmitters. And if you can think of it sort of as like a tug of war, where if, the little line in the middle of the rope passes a certain threshold, then the neuron's going to fire. And the glutamate is pulling that tug of war rope towards that threshold, trying to bring it closer to firing an impulse, whereas GABA is opposing it. It's trying to prevent it from firing. And so there's this constant kind of opposition. And that is one of the main things that determine whether or not a neuron is going to fire. Hey, from France. Hi, from the United States. I hope all is well in France. Oh, I forgot to ask Euro how things are going. Anyways, hopefully next time. So these are like the two sort of most critical, not most critical, but some of the most important neurotransmitter receptors in the brain. And so as a result, there's a lot of research into both glutamate receptors and GABA receptors. And in fact, I collaborated with somebody who discovered something totally wild about GABA receptors. And I'll sum it up this way. He's a brilliant scientist from Russia named Alexei Ostromov. He's I think, opened his own lab at Georgetown. I don't know how COVID has affected that. I hope not. But he's literally one of the smartest people I've ever met and had the privilege of working with. He discovered that one of the effects of chronic alcohol consumption, or I should say this, one of the effects of chronic stress. So we know that chronic stress predisposes people to addiction. It's one of the risk factors of addiction because, of course, these drugs help to relieve that anxiety and that stress. Well, he found that chronic stress can cause the polarity, the direction of GABA receptors to completely flip, meaning instead of being inhibitory, they become excitatory. And as we know, alcohol or ethanol modify GABAergic activity such that it tends to amplify GABAergic activity. And so the end product of this is that is one mechanism by which chronic stress causes people to be more likely to indulge in, mind-altering substances that either reduce anxiety or induce reward. Alcohol does both. That's one mechanism. That was like a very unorthodox claim, but he nailed it. He got a great publication out of it too. I think it was in Neuron. Okay, can you do a brain transplant? Oh, wait. Can you do a brain transplant? Theoretically, you can. Can I do one personally? No, definitely not. In fact, nobody alive today can do a brain transplant, though it evidently has been attempted. An Italian neurosurgeon named Sergio Canavero, he years ago at this point, I think like in 2016 maybe, or 2017 maybe, he said, I will be the first neurosurgeon to perform a head transplant, not a brain head transplant. But hey, I mean, that's still pretty great. And in fact, if you can keep your face, I imagine most people would want to do that anyway. So so he claimed he was going to be the first one to do it. He came up with this whole protocol. What did he call it? It was like the Gemini protocol, I think, right? Is that the constellation with the twins? Is that Gemini? I can't remember. Anyway, it's named after that. So he claimed he was going to be able to do it. He came up with this protocol, which was, and like I was like, hey, cool. Like, hey, if this dude came up with a way to effectively get the brain to reassociate with the rest of the central nervous system, this other person's nervous system, that would be a completely, that would be a huge paradigm shift in I almost called it magic in medicine. But it turned out that it was mostly just magic tricks. No, basically, he and I looked at the protocol, and it was just absurdly simple. Specifically, it's like, I'm really good at cutting things as a neurosurgeon, so I'm going to cut it so precisely that it won't like damage the axons. They'll be like perfectly severed. And then he had the use of fusogens, one of which was polyethylene glycol, which if you use e-cigs, you probably have some in your hand right now. That's polyethylene glycol. Anyways, and a bunch of, a couple other things. Simulation procedures to get the axons to connect. And he had participated he had done a head transplant between, was it him? I'm not 100% sure if it was him or if he was part of a group. Anyways, it had been done before where surgeons had transplanted the head of rats and the head of a dog. The difficulty here is that the studies only anticipated those animals to survive for like a maximum of 36 hours or maybe a little bit longer than that, and then they were sacrificed, they were euthanized, and so we don't know how long they would have survived. I'm almost certain it's also been done on a non-human primate. Just to be clear, that kind of research would never happen in the United States. I mean, maybe somebody would try it, but it would be illegal. Like, no way that the NIH, the NSF would ever fund something like that, let alone any kind of university. Xiaoping Ren, yes, that is the Chinese neurosurgeon with whom he collaborated. And anyways, so Sergio Canavero, this has been done before, so it's like, maybe it would work. Anyway, so
it then came out that he was going to collaborate with this team in China, this large team. I think it was something like 72 people on this team. And then this very, very talented Chinese neurosurgeon, Xiaoping Ren. And so they made this announcement. They, not only that, they found people who were willing to do this, to have their head transplanted. One of them had a terminal disease. And, I don't begrudge anybody for wanting to try something like that in those situations. And to be clear, we really do not know what it would be like to have essentially a disembodied consciousness. Like, it could just be the case that you just feel permanent, exquisite, excruciating pain, and there's no relent. It's just this throbbing pain constantly, and that's your reality, and you have no way of demonstrating that to the people around you. So you can't ask to be put under or something like that. So it could be quite macabre. Anyways, so he announced this partnership, and then they said that they had accomplished it. They had done it. And it was like, whoa, seriously? Pretty much everybody I know was like, come on, what? Really? And it turned out that they actually did it with a cadaver, which, that's cool. It's still very, very technically challenging, and they're very gifted for being able to pull it off, though we can't really scrutinize how true their claims are. Frankly, that's great if they want to do a cadaver head transplant. I think most people would be interested in having it happen before they pass away. So yeah, and I have not seen an update from that team since. And so my suspicion is that they probably have tried. Oh, and they're doing the surgeries in China, where they're far more lax kind of ethics regulations on biomedical science. Probably one of the reasons why allegedly CRISPR-Cas9 has been used to alter embryos in China. Allegedly. We don't know if that's true. But you can just get away with a bit more. There's just, it's different regulatory framework. So, I imagine they probably tried it, and I imagine they failed. Okay, that was a long little story time, huh? Oh, survived after 6 months. Oh, interesting. Thanks very much for the super heart, Shadow Joker. I really appreciate it. Do you know about your death? Do I know when I'm going to die? I do, but if I told you, it would alter the course of human history. So, is this a science podcast or a pseudoscience podcast? Sometimes we talk about pseudoscience, but not on my behalf. People bring up pseudoscience sometimes. This guy loves hypotheticals. I would argue that I am more prone to hating hypotheticals. That's why having a debate with a philosophy person, a philosopher, I guess is what you call them, is so frustrating, because they love hypotheticals. They love thought experiments, and to them that is like a mechanism of evidence. And no, as a scientist, specifically the kind of neuroscientist that I am, where I'm a circuits guy, not even psychology. I find it interesting, but my work was, involving the wet stuff. So no, I'm not a fan of hypotheticals. I'm not against them. Don't get me wrong. There are sites that can predict it. Yeah, I think I've tried one of those. But you talk about pseudoscience scientifically. Specifically name what we're talking about. Why don't you call in? We can debate it. I met God. He lives in Central Park. What is that from? Maybe we're disembodied consciousness right now. Maybe we're disembodied consciousness right now with neural input convincing us otherwise. It's very difficult to disprove that. Yeah. Any opinions on EMDR? So EMDR, for anybody that's not familiar, is a treatment modality. It's kind of weird, but it's a treatment modality, and there's some evidence to suggest that it is effective for treating things like PTSD. And basically, it is an exposure of a person's eyes, specifically to specific patterns and frequencies of light stimulation. And it's been used to treat PTSD to some degree of success. Do I have opinions on it? I mean, my opinions are solely based. Who cares what my opinions are, right? My opinions, I try and base my opinions as much as possible on evidence. I demonstrate that this treatment modality is effective, and hey, I'm all for it. I'll admit to being probably a bit more skeptical of EMDR than other treatment modalities, but yeah. Will my prolactinoma ever go away? Been battling for 20 years. Drugs, radiation. Oh man. I'm not an oncologist, let alone a cancer biologist. Yeah, so the best I can say is I certainly hope so, and best of luck with your treatment. It's also my mind typing. Can't hide from it. My mind has been trying to keep me sad. Huh. Yeah. Sorry. Let's see. What time is it? I should call it a day so that my wife doesn't lose her mind. So I have a YouTube channel, youtube.com/anthropoid. Today I talked about a new potential treatment for Parkinson's disease using stem cells, and a story. We had a little bit of story time of a clandestine operation that was performed on somebody involving having to get cells from Boston to Manhattan to perform the surgery, and secretly injecting 4 million stem cells into a specific part of the brain of a patient who funded the whole thing, who was a former physician himself. And you can check it out, YouTube. Oh, I also talked about dreams and COVID. There's a fun paper coming out that evaluates whether or not COVID is having an effect on people's dreams. Yeah, just sort of fun time paper. I think that's all I talked about. So yeah, youtube.com/anthropoid. I have a podcast. I'm negligent in updating it, for not updating it. It's called Wired to be Weird, and we talk about everything from dreams to drugs to dementia to disorders, and those are just the D words. So Wired to be Weird. You can find it on podcast platforms near you. And so yeah, with that, I'll call it a day. I'll see you next week, same time, same place. Let's do it. See you there. You can reach out on Twitter if you have any topics in mind. But until then, have a great week. See you guys. Hello, YouTube. This is that awkward time where I'm just winding things down. Okay, thanks for watching. As always, please, I'm open to any kind of feedback you have to improve this, and just let me know either in the comments below, or you can reach out on Twitter @anthropoid. Otherwise, have a great week, everybody. Thanks for watching.